Maybe some of you have heard this one before, but there was a priest and a pastor from their local parishes that were kind of across the street from one another, and they had put their heads together one day and they decided to put up a sign that said, "The end is near, turn yourself around now before it's too late." And together their plan was that they're going to hold that sign up to every passerby that would drive by. That's what they were going to see. And the very first driver who came by, he sees the sign and immediately is kind of outraged by this, and he says, he yells out the window, "Leave us alone, you religious nuts." And he speeds on by. And then as he went around the corner, they hear the screeching of tires and a big splash. And then the priest turns to the pastor and he says, "Do you think maybe we should have put up a sign that said, 'Bridge out' instead?" And the words from James chapter 1, verse 19 come to my mind, where it says this, "Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." And that first driver who had driven by, he had made an assumption. He made an assumption that the sign that was being held by the priest and the pastor was nothing more than a form of proselytizing, and yet the intent was genuine and sincere. And this driver, he forms a quick opinion that was based from his own perspective, and it brought him to his own judgment of the two men of the cloth, and he kind of dismisses them hastily, and maybe even put the pedal down afterwards too, after he had driven by, but splash, and into the drink he had went. But perhaps too, maybe the sign should have read, "Bridge out," rather than "The end is near." But again, shouldn't every person put into practice the being quick to hear, the being quick to listen, slow to anger? And I think this whole notion of being quick to hear, slow to speak, and being quick to listen, I think that often would seem to be the indictment that God had made of humanity throughout the ages. And people, God says, people, you just don't listen. And this would seem to be what is expressed, or what was expressed in Isaiah chapter 65 in our Old Testament reading, where the prophet, he's writing on behalf of God, expressing the frustration of God over a people who do not regard him in any way. They walk in ways that are not good. They follow their own devices. And these words of frustration, they're directed at a people that were supposed to know better. They were written, or what is written is directed at a people who claim faith and an allegiance in the living God, but they really didn't bear any resemblance to the God, their God at all. And if anything, they were turning people away by their holier-than-thou air about them, and through their practices and their rituals, which were really nothing but they're empty and void, because at the heart of it was not a purpose of knowing or seeking God, or even inviting others to know and seek God. In Isaiah 65, God is frustrated, and he's frustrated over the cycle that has continued throughout the generations, cycles of empty religion and cycles of iniquity. And what is iniquity? Well, iniquity is an act of injustice. It's a wicked act. We would call it sin. And it would seem that there is a profound price that God pays in being in relationship with the people of Isaiah 65. And so he declares judgment. All the previous generations' issues, the people of Isaiah will have to suffer for those too, because the cycle of iniquity had not broken with them. It just kept going on and on and on. And if only people would listen. And you know what? I feel that this is not just an indictment of the people of Isaiah 65, but it's an indictment of me. And yet God is still there before all people, offering mercy. Even after expressing words of frustration and judgment, he still stands with arms open wide, offering mercy and offering compassion and grace. There's a German theologian by the name of Romano Giardini who made this remark: "How is it that God permeates the universe, that everything that is comes from his hand, that every thought and emotion we have has significance only in him, yet we are neither shaken nor aflame by the reality of his presence, but able to live as though he did not exist? How is this truly satanic deceit possible?" That is a very loaded remark, isn't it? And another sort of a theologian too, this comes from Philip Yancey. And he speaks towards this. Really what we're talking about is a form of indifference that is being kind of pointed out here by Romano. And I think Philip Yancey kind of goes a little further with this, and he says, I marvel at a God who puts himself at our mercy, as it were, allowing himself to be quenched and grieved and even forgotten. And this, I think, really seems to be the indictment of Isaiah chapter 65. Reading through so much of the Old Testament convinces me of this human tendency. Indifference, taken to a far extreme, it bothers God far more than anyone else. And yet he remains gracious to doubters, and he remains this pursuer of willful unbelievers, and even becomes confounded and even enraged by those who simply put him out of mind, who are not quick to listen or hear. When God had delivered Israel from Egypt back in the Old Testament, Moses had said this to the people of whom he was care of in Deuteronomy 4, chapter 4, verse 9, and he says, be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. This was important, and to always have the faithfulness and love of God in one's memory. Do not forget. Do not forget what you have seen and learned and been witness of and experienced. But in time, Moses was going to have to face up to another reality. The reality that those delivered people in whom he was in care of would forget. Deuteronomy 8:14, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. And this forgetfulness, this spiritual amnesia confounds even the one and only true God. And it compels God to ask questions of why his people would ever ignore or forget him. In Jeremiah 32, you have some of these why questions that God throws out, such as these. Does a young woman forget her jewelry, a bride her wedding ornaments? Yet my people have forgotten me days without number. Does the snow of Lebanon ever vanish from its rocky slopes? Do its cool waters from distant sources ever stop flowing? Yet my people have forgotten me. This is the pain of God being expressed here. And some of the most emotional words, I think anyway, that come from the Old Testament, from the Bible of God's heart, come from Isaiah chapter 5, where God said this of Israel, and he said, makes this comment, I am like a moth to Ephraim, like rot to the people of Judah. Now, we are not the first people to read these words, and nor are these words directed at us specifically. We were not the primary audience or recipients of these words. But these are still words that are very piercing still, aren't they? Even shuddering. That the heart of God can be wounded, not only by the people of the time of Hosea, but even today, even now, and even by me. I remember reading a story. It was about a woman who was raised by parents who couldn't hear. They were deaf. And so sign language was all that they had between them to communicate with each other. And this woman was, as she was telling the story, when she was a young girl, and when in heated exchanges, however that would look, with her parents, she would simply just shut her eyes, close her eyes off. And so she wouldn't see anything that was being signed to her. And this would infuriate her parents, who had no other way to communicate with her except through signing. And as I think of this young girl with her eyelids tightly closed shut, off against the frantic hand motions or sign language from her parents, you know what, I get a picture. I get a picture before me. I get a picture of how God must feel when I shut him out. I know that God would feed our faith, that God would put a longing in our heart to know, a yearning and thirst to know God, the creator of all, the creator of you and I, because the more that we know and the more that we pursue, the closer we will stay. And how does this all happen? And I think it really does come by putting into practice this, being quick to hear, being quick to listen. And the story from our gospel reading clearly shows us that anyone can know God, and that there is no one who is too unworthy that they cannot come and discover who Jesus is. And really the whole Gospel of Luke, it's written to a specific person. It's written to a person by the name of Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus. Don't know really who he was, but it was written to him by Luke for the purpose of making known to him the things of Jesus that Luke had seen and the many others who were with him, that they had seen and discovered during their years of walking with Jesus. And he tells Theophilus the story of the life of Jesus, beginning with his birth and ending with his ascension. And in short, Luke is saying this: you have to be quick to listen to this story, because you need to know who Jesus is. And throughout much of Luke's gospel, we find that there's this band of disciples, those 12 that were walking with Jesus. And something kept them on the road following with Jesus or walking with him. And each day it had yet another experience and yet another lesson to be learned. And it was amazing, and it was encouraging, it was inspiring, and yet it was also confusing too, and even in many moments it was even frightening. Such as in Luke chapter 8. Before our reading from this morning, Jesus one day says to his disciples, let's go for a boat ride over to the other side. And they go. And there's this storm that whips up, and the disciples are terrified. And they had real reason for fear, because more than a few of the 12 were very seasoned guys, seasoned men out on the waters. They knew waters. They were experienced fishermen. And so this storm would have had to have been very wild for them to be afraid. And they have to wake up Jesus, and that's a story in and of itself, isn't it? Asleep through this storm, and they wake him up, and he tells the winds and the waves to knock it off, and everything becomes still. And the question, or the remark, who is this? Who is this that even the winds and the waters listen to him? They're trying to figure out who Jesus is too, the disciples. And when they reach the other side of the lake, once on the shore, they're met by a man who clearly knows who Jesus is. They're met by this naked man who lived in the tombs, the place of the dead, and he's wild and he's right out of his mind. He is right out of control. And the man runs toward them, and he's not asking for help. Not at all. What he does ask for is to be left alone. And he's not asking for healing or any of that. And it's not the man who's doing the asking either to leave me alone. It's the demons within him that are asking that. And they recognize who Jesus is right now. And they're afraid of him. Kind of brings Hebrews 10 to mind. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. The unclean spirits, they knew who Jesus was and were rightfully afraid. And as soon as Jesus saw this man come running toward him, he knew immediately that he was possessed. And without asking, he ordered the spirits to leave, to come out of him. And we see an unusual thing that happens here, where these spirits, they plead with Jesus, even negotiate, that they could enter this herd of swine rather than go back to the abyss or be sent to the abyss. And what's more, they succeed. Or do they? Because the moment they enter all the swine goes over the edge of a cliff, falls down to the ground, and they're killed or drowned. And, well, so much for their new home. And I wonder what most excellent Theophilus might have had going through his mind as he's reading through the pages of Luke's letter that he had given to him. How clear would it have been for him to see Jesus' heart and compassion and mercy for people? And while fingering through the pages, was he himself becoming familiar with who Jesus was? And while he might have been unfamiliar with Jesus before he started reading, would he have been learning of him in such a way that he just couldn't wait to get to the next page? He couldn't wait to keep reading forward. And when arriving at chapter 8, he discovered that while Jesus was still somewhat of a stranger to him, he was certainly no stranger in the spirit realm. He was known there, and the spirits that scare people were scared of him, fearfully afraid of him. And what a presence. What a power. A presence and power also accompanied by a kind of compassion and mercy that was near indescribable. And as awesome as Jesus was, Theophilus would have seen that people did not have anything to be afraid of him at all about, because he received everyone with open arms and with understanding. And he always offered them mercy through either healing someone of a sickness or disease, or through words of compassion or guidance or direction, forgiveness. And he gave the people the assurance that God loved them and God knew them. And it didn't matter who they were or what they had done. None of that mattered. And at the very moment someone met Jesus and would get to know him, even a little, they never left from him in the same condition in which they had arrived. They were changed, or they were challenged. They were given strength. All because of the faith and belief that God was for them, that God loved them. And as Theophilus would have read, he would also have seen in chapter 8 that the possessed man was a changed man. He was of sound mind, sitting at the feet of Jesus, and he's relaxed and he's at peace. And his disciples, they learned yet more of Jesus, but the other residents of the area weren't rejoicing as others were. No, they asked Jesus to leave the area because they were afraid. They were afraid of whom they did not know. But if they would have stuck it out a little longer, I wonder what they might have learned of Jesus. But they closed their eyes and shut him out. And perhaps, as Theophilus would have read on even further, did he come to the conclusion that Luke perhaps was leading him to? The same conclusion made by a centurion who stood at the foot of the cross where he said, "Truly, this is the Son of God." And what conclusion have you come to of Jesus? Do you believe that he is the Son of God? And if you do, how did you come to that conclusion? How did you come to this conclusion? How did you get there? Was it your mom or your dad? Or a friend who told you about Jesus? Who was it that made the Word of God come alive for you? Were you told the stories? I imagine Theophilus. I picture him in my mind, leafing through the pages in fascination and wonder, and perhaps even going back to previous stories that he had already read because he had made some new discovery that sparked his memory of a previous story that he'd read earlier. And what's happening is that his knowing of Jesus was deepening through the experience offered to him through the Gospel of Luke. And a relationship was being established. And how do you nurture? How do you nurture relationship with Jesus? Genesis chapter 24, verse 63 is just a very short verse that sort of describes Isaac, just to a degree. And yet, while it's so short, it says an awful lot about this question of nurture. And the verse goes like this: "And Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening." And without question, Isaac would have learned much from his father, from his dad, Abraham. Would have told him much, but he would have learned much, or what he would have learned from Abraham would have become that much more real to him during each time that he would go out into the field to meditate in the evening. To meditate and to think and to rethink, to pray, to be quick to listen and slow to speak, to listen for the still but very sure voice of God to be heard. Without nurture, the risk of forgetting will increase. Forgetting, not in the sense of memory loss, but maybe more in the waning of wonder, where an apathy might set in, where we shut ourselves off to him. Possibly even convincing ourselves that an awesome God, creator of all, is simply unknowable, unattainable, and far off. And yet the pages of the Bible tell us something completely otherwise. And we are told that he is always there, waiting with open arms, with compassion, and with mercy, and with grace. And perhaps the Apostle Paul said it best in Philippians chapter 4. "And now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true, and honorable, and right, and pure, and lovely, and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Keep putting into practice all you have learned and received from me, everything you heard from me and saw me doing. Then the God of peace will be with you." The God of peace will be with you. God is near, and God is here, and he's always on call, waiting for us all, and he's knowable, he's attainable, and he's full of love and grace and mercy and compassion and forgiveness. And we can walk with God. 1 John 1:3, "See what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called children of God. And so we are. So do not forget. Do not forget what a friend that we have in Jesus." Let's conclude our service in that way, in singing that great hymn from 770 in the LSB or off the screen.